introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this webinar. So today what I'm going to do is just provide an overview of a report that we wrote recently based on a large literature review that we carried out, trying to identify the different behavior change interventions that work for changing energy behavior, a wide range of different energy behaviors. So to give you an outline of what I'm going to cover today, I'll give you a quick introduction to SEAI's Behavioural Economics Unit, so who we are and what it is that we do. Then I will kind of talk a little bit about our search strategy, so how we found the different publications and reports that we included, and how we narrowed down our focus. Then I want to talk a little bit about encouraging households to save energy. So what have we found from that review? What does seem to work? I want to do the same thing for businesses. I want to review some of the evidence around changing transport behavior, although I will preface my presentation by saying we didn't find a whole lot of evidence in that area, so that little section might be a little short. Have a little look as well at school-based programs. Have a look at what seems to work there. Again, the evidence base is a little scarce, so might be a little bit short. Then I want to talk about the gaps that we kind of identified. So where are the areas where we need to carry out more research, and some particular suggestions about the actual way that we conduct research, the type of quality of studies that we do, and things like that. And then I'll finish with that with some recommendations for future research. So quite an ambitious agenda probably for the short period that I have to speak to you all today. So I'll probably just launch straight into it if that's okay. So let me just introduce you to our team. So our team is made up of 3 people, and then we're overseen by Phil Hemingway, who is our Research and Development Program Manager here in SEAI. So the team is myself. My own background is I have an undergraduate degree in business and finance, and then I went on to do a master's in behavioral science from the University of Stirling. So my kind of main areas of expertise, I suppose, will be in behavioral problem diagnosis, so trying to understand why is it that people engage in a certain behavior or don't engage in a certain behavior. Experimental design and implementation, which would be kind of, how do we construct a good experiment to actually test whether a particular intervention works or not. Then we have Mark Boacek, who is very strong in kind of data modeling and statistics. We'll do a lot of our statistics work here for us. And it's also quite handy in terms of it has a good experience of language programming, so can help us with data wrangling from complex databases and stuff like that. And his own background is psychology and neuroscience. And then we have Andrew O'Callaghan, whose background is quite varied actually. He originally started doing psychology, then did an MSc in neuroscience, and then has recently just completed another MSc, this time in carbon management. So a nice blend of the psychology background and the environmental policy. So that's our team. And what we do is that we try and encourage people and businesses to do a number of different things. So to overall reduce their energy use, so whether that's fuel like solid fuel or gas or electricity. Encourage businesses and people to install sustainable energy generation like solar PV or perhaps even solar thermal water heaters, things like that. We also try and encourage people and businesses to make more energy efficient purchases. So when they're purchasing appliances or machinery or things like that, we try and encourage them to purchase the most energy efficient versions of those as possible. We try and encourage people to install energy efficient upgrades. So this is largely in the residential sector, so things like insulation, things like heat pumps, heating controls, all of these things where there's a decent amount of evidence to suggest that they produce energy savings within the home. And then of course we also play an important role in terms of helping people and businesses learn about energy sustainability, and we do that, for example, through our schools program. And I guess we try and do this through the entire phase, so through the design, build and use of energy systems or buildings. The idea being that we want to design energy systems and buildings to be as energy efficient as possible. We want to build them to those specifications as close as possible so that we realize that potential. and then also that we use those energy systems to actually realize the energy efficiency potential of those systems. So we all know, for example, you can build an extremely energy efficient building, but if people are, doing things like leaving on air conditioning over the weekend when they go home, say, for example, or something like that, that different behaviors that people enact can undo our good efforts that we've made in the building design phase. So it's important to focus on all three phases when we're trying to deliver real behavior change. So I just thought it might be useful to give a quick overview of, what is behavioral economics, or at least what is behavioral economics as we define it, and how we use it. And so really, what I would say is behavioral economics is really a blend of three main different fields, so economics, psychology, and sociology together. And I'm going to do something now that the academics who might be listening in will probably want to shoot me for, but please forgive me. I'm going to try and summarize each of those fields in 2 words. So in terms of economics and the insights that economics brings to behavioral economics, I guess the overarching lesson is that, look, incentives matter. So incentives definitely do shape behavior. So when we think about energy, that obviously relates to things like people do think about the payback period to a certain extent, and are influenced by payback periods, in particular businesses are. And people are also influenced by things like time of use pricing. So we can shift when people use energy if we introduce time of use tariffs, say, for example. To summarize psychology in 2 words, I suppose I would say context matters. So it's not just the incentive structure that matters, it's also the context in which people find themselves enacting these different behaviors or making these decisions or trying to understand these incentives that play a role in determining what behavior they actually engage in. So for example, things that also are really important and influence people's behavior are the level of feedback that they receive, the level of kind of hassle factor associated with carrying out something. So upgrading my home, if it's a lot of work to do that, I might be less likely to do that than if the process is very simple. And things like availability bias. So for example, we do a lot of surveys here in Ireland asking people, what is the best way to save energy in the home? And what we see coming back all the time is, oh, I should turn off the lights, and I should, not charge my phone until I absolutely need to charge it, and stuff like this, or not leave it plugged in when it's not charging, and all these kind of things. And all those small behaviors, yes, are helpful, but they're probably not the best thing that people can do to reduce their energy use. I think some of what's going on there is an availability bias in that, they're the things that we think about most when we think about energy, or that we interact with most, which is lights, small appliances or kitchen appliances. And so that's why our mind instantly thinks that they're the areas where we need to reduce use. Sociology then, I suppose, would broadly kind of say, look, well, culture and society matters as well. So it's not just an individual view. So we're not just looking at a single person in isolation. We all exist within communities and other different types of groups, and people within organizations obviously are, may behave differently depending on the particular sector or department that they are in within that business and so on. The actual culture and society and context that people find themselves in plays a huge part in determining people's behavior. So things that are important is obviously the action of our neighbors. So we know, for example, that as more solar PV gets installed in an area, the uptake rate actually starts to increase as people noticing their neighbors already have it. And also, it's really important that when we, on the national scale, when we're focusing on kind of environmental policy, that we're, leading from the front, so to speak, so that people feel that, yes, when I'm doing this as well, other people are moving in the same direction as me, to get rid of this kind of feeling of tokenistic gestures. We don't want people thinking, well, I save a bit of energy here, and that's not great because it's only a drop in the bucket and no one else is trying. We want to move everyone in the same sort of direction at the same time, and so that influences their perception of the consequences of their own behavior. So hopefully that was a short enough summary into what behavioral economics is. So I'll just talk a little bit about now the search strategy and focus of our review. And basically what we did was we examined what works for a range of different behaviors, but these are the broad categories. So encouraging homeowners to install energy efficiency measures. So like, as I say, things like insulation or even things like solar panels. Encouraging businesses to install energy efficiency measures. So that also can be things like solar panels and insulation, but it might also be new equipment or machinery. We wanted to look at reducing energy use at work. So this is, maybe process orientated, or people in offices say, not turn the lights off when they leave, those kind of things. So kind of the individual behaviors that people enact at work that have a consequence or consequential effect on energy. We want to look at reducing transport-related emissions if we could find any good literature on that. We want to look at reducing energy use in the home. So again, similarly, how do people use energy at home? How do we encourage them to use energy different times of day? How do we encourage them to use less in general? And then, of course, we want to look at how do we encourage the purchase of energy efficiency appliances. So, we didn't really set ourselves too big of a task. We just tried to cover all of those bases. So we were being quite ambitious. So what we did was we read a lot of papers and reports. So we conducted kind of a typical database search of journals and different academic sources. And we used a list of kind of pre-approved key search terms and words that I can share afterwards. And we identified a certain number of papers. So that was the first thing that we did. We also talked to some experts in behaviour change in Ireland and asked them for recommendations of things that we should look out for, or papers that they were aware of that were particularly important. And we also did a bibliography search. So in any kind of meta-analysis or review that we came across as part of this search, we would then in turn look at all the articles within the references there and then try and take sources from there as well. And after we'd done the database search and these other searches, we were eventually left with kind of 695 papers that looked broadly relevant to what we were trying to achieve. And so what we did then was we read the abstract of those and we said, okay, is this paper now meeting our inclusion criteria, which I'll talk about in a minute. And after that, basically we were left with 176 papers that we knew that we would review in full detail and summarize. So really, we really did read a lot of papers and reports. So this is the search strategy, and this is how it breaks down across different end-use behaviors and stuff like that, but I won't go into that in too much detail. I think what's important to talk about here is our inclusion criteria. So we had about 8 or 9 different criteria, but the main 2 which are really important that I'll focus on now. The first thing was that they had to include metered savings or an observed behavior. So we didn't include any studies that were self-report. We didn't include any studies that were kind of modeled estimates based on a predicted behavior or anything like that. It had to be some sort of verifiable or observed behavior and preferably metered savings. And then we also had another kind of stringent inclusion criteria, which was we wanted the study to at least include some form of control group and to do that for a decent time period so that we could say, okay, well, the effect of the intervention, we can actually kind of get some sort of causal estimate of those because we know there was a control group. So I think how we defined that was it had to be a form of counterfactual impact evaluation if it was going to be included. I should say here that, we do recognize when we did that that is being quite strict. There are a lot of case studies that we were aware of in general and stuff that became excluded as a result of these. But really what we wanted to do was we wanted to say, look, what does the evidence base currently say is kind of robust enough that if someone said to you in a high-pressure scenario, give me an energy policy I could do tomorrow, and you'd be relatively confident it'll have a positive impact, that, that's what we were aiming for. Those were the type of interventions that we wanted to find at the end and be able to report back. So we summarized each paper in a standard template. I hope you can see that there, but I can share it afterwards in detail if people would like to see it. But basically, we were very detailed about the different things that we captured in each paper, and this was useful because, one, it provided a useful summary for every paper that we read, so when we went back to actually write the report, it was quite easy. But also, it produced a library, which hopefully in time I can share as well, that basically is searchable on any of these attributes. So, what the outcome measure was, how long was it, what was the counterfactual impact evaluation type, was the intervention delivered by SMS or email, all these different things that we thought were important to capture, we tried to capture in this standard template. So then we agreed some common themes, so the 3 of us met together after we'd read all our papers and summarized them, and we said, okay, what do we think we've identified, what if we were going to write this into chapters, what would that look like? We agreed on those, and we wrote a policy note, and so this document came to be. and that's available on our website on SEAI.ie if anyone wants to get a copy of it. Okay, so what did we actually find? What did we try, or what did we learn from this big exercise? The first area that I want to focus on is encouraging households to save energy. I think the first thing that I'll do is I'll just give a broad summary of the different types of interventions, and then I'll give you a couple of specific examples. I think that's the best way to go about it, otherwise we might be here for a very long time indeed. So the first thing that we found to be quite effective was asking people to set commitments or targets or goals was very successful. So usually asking people to set targets or goals of somewhere in the range between 5, 10, 15%, but preferably about 10 or 15%, would lead to actual savings of about 10 to 15%. 10% was kind of the most common figure, and when we looked at some of the meta-analysis, that's what they seem to suggest. So if you can encourage people to set goals where they themselves say, yes, I want to save energy, and if you give them some feedback about how they're doing, and if they're held publicly accountable for those to their goals. So for example, if you put a leaderboard up on social media, or if you were to publish the results in a newspaper, if we're talking about firms or something like that, that stuff does seem to have a decent level of impact. We looked at the effectiveness of home energy audits or home energy checkups. So, where someone would come to your house with a bunch of energy-saving equipment and also energy efficiency diagnostic equipment like thermal imaging cameras and stuff, and they would walk you through your house, explain where you're potentially losing energy, and also take the time to install things like low-flow shower heads while they were there in the house. And what we found was that roughly the savings associated with that were roughly around 4%. What's really interesting about those is that while the savings are a little bit less than, say, commitment or goal setting, it does also present a unique opportunity to be in the home of the homeowner, so to learn more about their home and what they might need to upgrade, and also to actually do that, to actually sell them on the idea of energy efficiency upgrades, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. We also looked at the effect of kind of O-Power style reports, so kind of giving people feedback on their use. And typically, in line with kind of the O-Power meta-analysis that was done recently, what we see is that giving people kind of social comparative feedback and those types of things seem to lead to around a 3% energy saving at the household level. And that's quite persistent over long time periods. In terms of the financial incentives, I'm going to put up a figure now. The savings, they seem to be in and around 3%, but I would be a little less confident about this number. There were less studies. The studies usually included a lower sample because obviously the cost of paying someone a financial incentive makes those studies a little bit prohibitive to do from time to time. And there was some evidence of kind of backfiring effects and things like that, where once the financial incentive was taken away, people reverted to their old behavior and things like that. So what I would say is financial incentives do seem to be somewhat impactful for at least some time. But, if you're thinking about it from a policy perspective, there are other considerations in terms of affordability and how long you can really afford to kind of persistently give people financial incentives that are worth taking on board. Looking at kind of competitions, like, these kind of competitions where you would have communities or groups of houses or things like that try and compete against another community or another group of houses, the savings are roughly around 5 percentage points. Again, the evidence is a little bit more scarce here. There's a lot more kind of case study work here where they, would run a very large energy saving competition in one town versus another town, and then have a control town as well and stuff like that, which didn't really meet our inclusion criteria. So this stuff does seem to work, but again, I would have some questions about the persistence of those effects. And then probably one of the most interesting ones that we came across was some of the evaluations of the Nest learning thermostat that were done by Nest and the Behavioural Insights team, and similar reports on other smart heating controls that came from the United States do seem to suggest that giving people smart heating controls which automate a lot of their heating and the control of it seems to produce savings of around 4%. So it's a good argument, I suppose, in favour of automation there, at least in the heating domain. So I talk through some examples now, some specific examples of the studies that we found and what seemed to work well. And I just want to frame it using the EASE framework from the Behavioural Insights team. So the Behavioural Insights team, have this EASE framework if you haven't heard it before, and what they basically say is that if you want someone to do something, you should make it easy, you should make it attractive, you should make it social, and you should make it timely. And so I want to give you an example of what I mean by each of those now. So in terms of making it easy, probably the best way to make something easy for someone is to default someone into some option. And defaults are incredibly powerful. So they're worth thinking about in any situation, any behavior change project that we work on. The first question we would look at is, okay, what are the main choices here, and what are the default settings if there are any? And do we have an opportunity to change them? Because they have the potential for the largest impact in my view. So if we look at some typical studies looking around kind of home energy reports and stuff like that, there's two choices for defaulting people. We can either have them on an opt-in basis where they choose to opt in to receive home energy reports, or obviously on an opt-out basis where they can where we automatically enroll them and then say, look, if you don't want to be part of this, you can opt out and that's fine. So what happens is in the opt-in condition, about 20% of people usually will opt in for home energy reports at least, but usually that's broadly similar. I mean, for most programs, you're talking those type of rates, anywhere between 10, 50, and 20%. That's the level of kind of engagement of active people that you will get. Obviously, the more complicated the particular intervention, the lower the engagement rate, but around that rate. Whereas for opt-outs, we really do see these massive effects where people, they clearly have the choice to opt out if they wish, but they just don't. And there's lots of survey work done to show that this isn't just inattention and stuff like that. Some of it might be, but that it's also being driven by the fact that people take the default option a lot of time as a recommendation. So they say, well, this is the default, so this must be the thing that I'm meant to do. And then there's other elements of, hassle factors and stuff that's contributing to that high number. So what you find is with the opt-in group, the energy savings are around 5.9%. So that's actually pretty good. That's relatively high. And in the opt-out group, they're much smaller. They're around 2%. But of course, if we can get 98% of people saving 2% of their energy use, it's much more impactful than having 20% of people saving 5.9%. So one of the most important things we can do is that any opportunity that, or if there's any choice that we're asking people to make, if we can set the default to be energy efficient default, that would be advantageous. In terms of making it easy as well, I've already touched on this, so I'll go quite quickly through this, but one of the things that we obviously found was that giving people smart heating controls and automating their energy saving work for them was really effective. So if we look at traditional heating systems or the heating controls that you have to use to interact with your heating system, a lot of them are quite difficult. So we did some work on this previously, reviewing evidence around this, and they score quite poorly on a system usability scale. So people really struggle to actually use their heating controls. So whether it's a kind of a dial thermostat like this, or whether it's a T or V type valve on an individual radiator, whether or not people fully understand them, I think, even if they fully understand them, which is kind of in question, it's a bit of a hassle to go around and constantly change these things and update them based on, is it a little bit warmer outside today, a little bit colder? And so automating these type of decisions through something like a Nest Learning thermostat does seem to produce decent energy savings, and the results are there. You can add an additional bit of saving if you ask the Nest thermostat to be a bit more aggressive with its energy saving techniques through an auto-learning algorithm. In terms of making it attractive, it's always worth looking at how are we framing a particular message around how we're trying to encourage someone to change their behavior. This comes from a nice study done in UCLA by Asensio and Delmas. And they had a large number of apartment buildings, and what they did was, in the apartment units, and what they did was they randomly assigned some to get a financial message like the one you're seeing on your screen now. So, you use more energy, you're spending more, the implication being you could save more on your energy bill if you use less energy. And then they randomly assigned another portion of those apartment dwellers to a health frame. So apologies, maybe this might be a little bit small, but basically what this says is This says that over this period you use certain amount pounds of air, or the energy you use produce this amount of air pollutants, which contributes towards things like childhood asthma and cancer. So I guess a little bit of a guilt trip if you like, but more just kind of framing things in terms of the health impact of people's energy decisions. And what they find here is that both of them have roughly the same level of impact at the start. So you can see there after the first couple of days of treatment, the energy savings are roughly the same. And after about 21 days then of receiving messages like this, the results really start to diverge. So the monetary savings groups of the people who are constantly being given this financially framed message seem to become kind of a little bit numb to that message, or maybe it's just not particularly motivating, or maybe they realize the savings aren't as big as they thought, or something like that. And they go back to their old way. They stop saving energy. Whereas the health frame message continues on and produces kind of a persistent effect of energy saving. And I think that's really interesting because a lot of the time when we're selling energy efficiency or we're selling, asking people to reduce their use, or even with demand-side management to shift their use, we focus on the financial benefits. And in reality, for a lot of people anyway, their energy costs are only a relatively small portion of their household budget. So it's not a particularly strong motivator. Focusing on things like the consequences for other people's health or even their own, or focusing on things like comfort and warmth might be better messages, and those are the things that are worth testing. In terms of making it social then, we have the O-Power example. So we have, comparing people's energy use to that of their neighbours. And I don't need to go through this probably in too much detail. I think people are quite aware of how effective that is. But what's useful in this particular study is they added another layer to this. So people who are receiving these home energy reports, they also wanted to see, can we shift some of their use from peak times into off-peak times? And to do that, what they did was they basically set up robocalls to call people before an energy use demand event. And this is the message that they used here. So you can say this is an alert from the utility. Tomorrow is a peak day from 1 to 6. Try and reduce your energy, so on and so forth. And then they also gave them a call afterwards to say, thank you very much. You reduced your energy use, and that's great. And so what we see here, what the results are, if you look across this chart, the first one here is HER group. That's just the people who are getting those home energy reports. So again, in line with the usual findings, about an energy reduction of 2%. If you give people these kind of augmented reminders, the ones with the robocalls, you get a 3.8% reduction. If you add those together, you get a 5.9% reduction. But then if you look at a group where they actually randomly assign people to receive both the HER and the PER at the same time, or at least if the same individuals got those, you actually get kind of an extra little boost. And what's interesting about these findings is that the authors try and look at the elasticity of energy here, and they say it would take a price increase of 70% to generate the same savings. So there's clearly a lot of potential here in terms of how we frame things and the different ways that we make things social to help people reduce their energy use. Making it social, I've already touched on this, so I'll just skip ahead on this because I'm just conscious of time. But again, asking people to set goals and public commitments, quite effective. In terms of making it timely, there's quite an interesting trial going on here in Ireland. It's not a fully proper randomized control trial, but it is a good proof of concept nonetheless. And what they're doing is they're asking people to turn off, it's called Power Off and Save, and they ask people to turn off the different devices within their house to reduce their energy use at peak times, similar to the last study I was just going to talk about in detail. What they do is they send text reminders out to people. And this is something that has been shown to be quite effective across a wide domain of a range of different behaviors. Sending text reminders at the moment in time when you want people to change their behavior or reduce their energy use in this case can be really effective. And of course, another way to make things timely is to provide people with instant feedback. So we know from studies even in Ireland where we conducted a randomized control trial of kind of giving people smart meters and time of use pricing. If you give them a smart meter with some time of use pricing, you'll see average savings are around 3%. But if you give them that and a home energy display that allows them to see the differences in the prices of the time of use tariffs in real time and also monitor energy use in real time, you see you get additional energy savings. Okay, so that was the main section of encouraging household behavior, or encouraging households, to change their energy behavior, I want to quickly talk about how do we encourage the installation of energy efficient measures and the purchase of energy efficient appliances, mostly within homes. So how can we prompt more homeowners to take action? One way, as I alluded to earlier, is through these kind of quick home energy checkups. So these would usually be provided by utilities. They would send someone out, they would do a 1-hour free checkup of the home, identify areas for improvement, provide energy saving tips, and they would also leave behind things like CFLs, aerators, efficient flow shower heads, water tank heat wraps, and these kind of things. And these do seem to produce decent energy savings. And of course, as I said earlier, they present a unique opportunity to be in the home with the homeowner and discuss the potential for future larger upgrades as well. So that's what they did in this particular case, was they left these kind of simplified energy reports with people and said, look, these are some of the other bigger upgrades you could do. And you can see here that they represented that quite nicely with a couple of icons in terms of trying to convey the different levels of cost or disruptions of work and the levels of savings that would arise from those works in this short little report. Training of auditors also seemed to be effective. So a lot of utilities, especially in America, seem to offer kind of phone-based audits where people will receive a phone call and they'll ask them a couple of questions like, oh, sorry, could you just go and check if your boiler is insulated or things like that. And some studies have shown that giving these auditors who are doing these audits over the phone specific training in kind of behavioral science techniques, or if you like, really just in how to be persuasive and use persuasive language, seems to be quite effective. So one of the phrases here, just to give you an example that they trained them to use, was when talking about insulation, they said, look, the gaps add up in your house. If you add up all the little tiny cracks and everything that's in your house, it would actually be like having a football-sized hole in your wall. And this kind of powerful or salient language can really put things into perspective for a homeowner and also make it more simple and easy to understand for the homeowner so that they kind of realize, okay, now I understand why I need to invest in energy efficiency. It is interesting that while these programs of training auditors did seem to kind of increase the amount of people taking out grants and stuff like that, so doing kind of, maybe purchasing an energy efficiency appliance or installing insulation or something like that, the authors weren't actually able to identify a difference in actual energy savings at the end of the intervention as measured by energy bills. And some of that's due to dropout in sample size, but it's also possible that there's things like rebound effects going on. And I think we have to be conscious of that when we're running these types of studies. Are community-based social marketing approaches more effective? So I'll cut the suspense. In my view, I think yes. I think they're a largely untapped area. I think there's been some good initial work in this area, but this could be a real push now in the coming years to try out some community-based social marketing approaches and see where exactly the limits of that approach is. Can we use these types of methods for more complicated behaviors like upgrading or retrofitting your home? So let me just give you an example of one that has been conducted already. So what they were trying to do here was they wanted to increase the sale and installation of LED bulbs in part of America. I can't actually remember right now, unfortunately, where it was. But basically what they were doing was this social marketing approach says, pick a very specific behavior that you want to focus on. And in this case, they got really specific and they said, we want people to install at least one LED in a recessed can light fixture in their home. And that was the entire kind of guiding goal of that entire intervention. Then they carry out a lot of research to try and understand what are the different barriers and motivators that might either deter someone from doing that or encourage them to do that. And then they would design an intervention around that based on their findings and try and encourage more people to do that behavior and then measure it with a control group. And so one of the things you can see here in the picture that they did was they ran in-store events showing people what the quality of LED light is compared to, say, traditional light bulbs. They answered questions that people had about them. They dispelled commonly held myths of things like, some people were saying to them, well, I do want to change my light bulbs, but shouldn't I wait until my light bulbs actually go out, because otherwise it's wasteful. And they were trying to explain to them, no, by continuing to use kind of an energy inefficient incandescent bulb for another 5 years before it blows, that's a lot more wasteful than, kind of getting rid of or recycling the incandescent bulb now and putting an LED in now. So some of the other things, it's in North Carolina. Thank you, I should have progressed my own slide. So some of the things they did was the treatment included, they got instant rebates on light bulbs if you were purchasing them in the store on these days. There was in-store signage for a week before this one-day event where they were trying to drive sales. Flyers placed in customers' bags for a week before, promotion at a home energy show, so on and so forth. You can see this is multifaceted. They're really trying to do pretty much everything they can think of to try and encourage this one specific behavior. And I suppose what's really interesting is the scale of the success of this. So sales increased by 896% of LED bulbs in that area at the time. Again, the authors couldn't find any statistically significant difference in energy use between the control and treatment homes. And again, that's due to follow-up and data quality issues to some degree. So it's hard to know exactly how much energy this did save, but just looking at the actual graph of, the difference between the control and treatment stores here, it's clear that this campaign or intervention at least had an impact on the sale of LEDs and hopefully likely had an impact on the installation rate and therefore on people's energy use. So I think this is an approach that, it remains kind of largely untapped and that we can do more work in. I think this does apply to more complicated behaviors. So we did come across a great study by Foley et al. Where they looked at encouraging applications to a free weatherization program using a similar community-based social marketing approach. So this was really interesting. It's similar to a program we have here in Ireland called Warmer Homes, where basically low-income households are eligible for 100% free upgrade work, and that's usually insulation, replacement of old boilers and things like that. What they did here was, the approach they took was 23,500 robocalls. So I'm kind of glad that we ban robocalls in Ireland, so I'm not receiving any sort of level of robocalls like that. They did 15,000 door hangers, so giving information about the scheme and encouraging people to find out more and to sign up. 7,000 actual home visits where they went door to door trying to encourage people to sign up for this free scheme. And they ran sign-up assistance events where they actually would ask people, or they would actually help people fill out the form. And there's actually an interesting piece in that article, the journal article, where they actually talk about, the extent to which they went to try and help people. And there's actually an instance they report where they drove someone from their house down to the sign-up assistance station to actually fill in the form. So they were really trying to get people to upgrade their homes here. And what you can see is that there was an effect. So in the control group, the non-encouraged group, you had a 1% completed weatherization rate. And in the treatment group, you had a 6% completed weatherization rate. And if we look at that, how that breaks down across the contact, a large amount of people who were contacted in the encouraged group didn't even go on to do an application or to fill in an application, and a lower proportion of people who did fill in an application actually went on to complete weatherization. So there's clearly barriers and hurdles there that people find difficult to clear. And so these interventions are effective, but they do also still have the limitations of the fact that, look, energy efficiency upgrades for the home in particular are quite a complicated, lengthy process for the homeowner to involve themselves in. It's also actually worth noting here that, the authors don't find a statistically significant difference. And this time, not so much due to follow-up issues. They're worried that in this case, that the modeled estimates of the energy efficiency benefits the upgrades would lead to were actually off by a large amount, and in reality there's a lot of either comfort taking or there's different elements of how the upgrades are done and so on that lead to actually not as much energy savings being produced as was thought anyway originally. So encouraging purchase of more energy efficient appliances. I might just actually take a quick glass of water here because I've been talking for quite a while. Excuse me. Encouraging purchase of more energy efficient appliances. So I think we've seen a lot of studies around this area, and they do tend to focus on reframing existing energy labels. And that makes sense because energy efficient labels are a quick win opportunity, right? If we can find a way that seems to change behavior, it's a very easy change to make to energy efficiency labels, and we change a lot of behavior. But unfortunately, when we read more and more of this evidence, you see very large effects in lab studies for these kind of things. So people do seem to respond to kind of putting things like 5-year energy costs on the label and things like that, or redesigning or reformatting the label. But in the field studies, the impact is a little bit lower. The tend to be around 1%. So particularly around large appliances that consume a lot of energy, like dishwashers or washing machines or dryers. And that's probably for a couple of reasons. One, it's hard to get experimental control in a field experiment for something like this. Two, it's hard to do follow-up with people again, so there's data issues. And three, obviously the lab experiment has the advantage of, the people are clearly attending to the labels. It's not so much of a noisy environment, and you can isolate the effect a lot more. But these are some of the other designs that we came across. This is a nice design where they kind of frame things as either a gain or a loss, compared to, so basically if you had, say, a vacuum cleaner, they would compare that to the average vacuum cleaner in a similar class, and then they would tell you whether that particular one was going to either save you more money or lose you more money in comparison to the average, and that seemed to work well. And here's another example that the Behavioral Insights team used in a study with an appliance retailer in the UK, and you can't probably see it there, but in that little black box they've added running costs, I think, for 5 or 3 years again. And again, they find a very small effect for some appliance types. And so this approach is very popular. As I say, medium effect size in lab experiments, but smaller effects in field trials. Bonus malus and subsidy type schemes are also something that we kind of half came across, but technically we weren't looking at in this review. But I will just say they do seem to be effective in terms of they do encourage more purchases of energy efficient appliances, but they seem to have a negative impact also in that they encourage people to purchase larger appliances than they otherwise would have. I think we can do some more work in this area in particular using kind of those community-based social marketing methods I was just talking about for lighting. And Alcott finds kind of stricter efficiency standards to be a more effective approach here. And that might somewhat indicate, the limits of the behavioral science approach. There are small tweaks we can make, but sometimes it just makes more sense to, look at the efficiency standards and set a stricter efficiency standard and encourage manufacturers to innovate rather than leave all the burden on the consumer. Okay, so encouraging businesses to reduce their energy use, and I'm going to speed up a little bit because I'm just conscious of time. So here it's harder to give you exact numbers because there was less studies and there was no real meta-analysis in this area. So what I can say is that goal setting, especially for like mid-level management where you make managers responsible for those goals, does seem to be a positive thing to do. Does seem to lead to energy savings of anywhere between 5, 10, and 20% for businesses, depending on how it's done. Giving them free energy audits or subsidized energy audits, again, does seem to work, but not something we have great counterfactual impact evaluation type evidence for. And I would argue that's a big gap because a lot of countries have subsidy schemes for business energy audits or even offer free energy audits. And I think we need to really understand the actual cost-benefit ratio there of how effective those programs are. Giving energy reports to businesses, like similar to the O-Power type reports that we give to homeowners, are not effective, but giving them more generalized feedback is. So more generalized feedback leads to savings of about 7%, but giving them kind of just simple energy bill-based type feedback, like the O-Power type stuff, doesn't seem to be effective for businesses based on the studies that I've seen so far. And again, competitions do seem to be successful around a 7% saving. So just give you an example of a good study that we came across here looking at energy use in commercial buildings. So we had three groups that people were assigned to, and it was based on the floor of the building they were in. We had a control group that had no contact. We had a treatment floor that received weekly emails with actionable energy tips and inter-floor competitions, and they were given the results of that competition every week. You can see here that's the building it was done in. You can see how they kind of randomly assigned different floors to either be control or treatment, and some floors were excluded because they weren't part of the company who were doing this trial. These are the energy saving emails, so very, very simple. They literally just, here you go, here's 3 tips that you can kind of use in your day-to-day goings in the office to help save energy. And then they had a second treatment group where they sent them those emails, but they also assigned a weekly energy champion for each floor. And that seemed to be quite effective. So if we look at the results here, there's positive results for both groups, but the biggest effect is for the group where there was also a weekly assigned energy champion. And that energy champion was basically responsible for, at the end of the day before they went home, if someone had left their computer on standby, he was allowed to turn it off. Or if there were lights left on inadvertently, he could turn those off. And so empowering people to actually, go around and do these things can be quite impactful. These results did seem to be somewhat persistent, but there was evidence of decay, but there was still positive effects, I think, after nearly 6-7 months, if I remember correctly. So what works for changing transport behavior? And like I said at the start, this was a lot harder to find evidence for. And again, I totally acknowledge that that's probably because we were very strict with our inclusion criteria. Most of the studies in this area tend to be case studies or tend to be non-counterfactual impact evaluation. And that's because transport behavior is extremely hard to measure and it's very hard to construct counterfactuals for. So I totally get that, and there are lots of learnings we can take from other case studies as well. But what we did find in the type of evidence that we were looking for was evidence that eco-driving does type of programs where you teach businesses or employees in businesses how to drive more efficiently do seem to be effective. So this particular study tried to encourage people to save fuel, so the control had no reward for using less fuel. The first treatment group got a success. If they were successful in reducing fuel, they would get a voucher towards a free meal, I think it was. And in the second group, they just got a straight-up financial reward, so they got a certain amount based on how much they saved. And the results showed that after receiving the training, that those who received the vouchers reduced their use by 5%. There was some savings for the financial group, but not to the same extent. And the effect did seem to dissipate after 6 months. But what's interesting is that they actually gave the incentives first and followed up with a training course later on. And what they found was that you needed both to get these effects. So there was no savings until all of the drivers had actually received the eco-driving training. I suppose that goes back to kind of thinking about, people need both the motivation to change their behavior, but they also need the capability to change their behavior, in this case provided by the training. We found similar results for airline pilots. There's a great study looking at Virgin Media Airlines where they basically did a similar type of approach, and they asked pilots to fly more efficiently or to taxi more efficiently and to use less fuel than they thought, to calculate the fuel they thought they needed for the trip more carefully. And what they found was huge savings, and that was mostly due to an observer type effect. The fact, obviously, that the pilots kind of knew, hey, someone's keeping tabs on how efficiently I'm flying, seemed to drive their change in behavior in that case. Again, a second study found that setting managerial targets, so making managers personally responsible for their employees driving more efficiently, and providing training as well as that, did seem to reduce fuel use by around 7%. So eco-driving probably something is that we can start trying to encourage more and maybe run programs for businesses to encourage them to do that with their employees. We also, this didn't fit our inclusion criteria, but I thought it was important to include. We came across this kind of idea of smarter travel towns, and it's kind of this multi-pronged approach to trying to encourage large-scale modal shifts within certain towns, and it's been tried both in the UK and here in Ireland. So this particular one that I'm going to present on is from the UK, but they looked at 3 different towns and tried a community-based modal shift program. Again, these are quite extensive and quite intensive, so they gave people personal travel planning. There was travel awareness campaigns. They promoted walking and cycling. There was public transport marketing. In the Irish example, they even went further and they did things like build protected cycle lanes and stuff like that. And the results that they report in their study is that the car journeys decreased by 9%, bus journeys increased by 10 to 22%, and you can see the rest of the results there. And the similar results were seen in Ireland. I guess it's hard to attribute exactly all of that change to these interventions because, again, it's hard to get a good counterfactual, but it does seem that if you kind of really focus an intensive campaign on a particular area where you know there is potential for modal shifts, that you can encourage it. Okay, so the effectiveness of school-based programs in changing energy behavior. And then I'm getting towards the end here, and then I'll be happy to stick around for questions. This is an area where there is very, very little research. So a number of countries do have kind of school-based programs that are focused on raising awareness among children in particular, around energy literacy, and also trying to give them energy-saving tips in the classroom that translate to energy-saving behavior when they actually go home. But there's very little evidence as to whether this works or not. There's two main strands of research in this area. The first is, as I say, these kind of classroom-based education on energy or energy-saving tips in the environment, with the idea being that they learn it in school and they bring it home. Very few controlled studies, many programs that are designed with the aim of changing attitudes rather than behavior, which in my view would be somewhat problematic because the evidence would suggest that, you know, you often can change behavior without needing to change attitudes. So there's no real, in a lot of cases anyway, you know, it's more important to focus on getting them to actually change the behavior rather than to try and do that kind of, if you like, by virtue of the fact that you've changed their attitude. And this is understudied and underdeveloped. There's another section of this kind of education-based research, which is kind of saving energy in university accommodations, so in dorm rooms and stuff like this. And this is often used to test the impact of behavior change interventions in the absence of direct financial incentives. There's a few studies here, but again, the sample sizes are a little bit smaller than you'd like, and the follow-up periods are often short because the semesterization of most colleges means that, you know, tenants change rooms quite often. And there has been savings found here of about up to 22%. So an example, and excuse me, I couldn't resist the pun, of best-in-class evaluation for these type of programs comes from Agarwal et al., and this is based in Singapore. And what they basically did was use a very clever design here to try and work out whether in-class-based education on energy and energy-saving tips translates to energy saving at home. And you can see here that, you know, they had a number of treatment schools and a number of control schools, and they're all marked on that map quite nicely. And this took part of a wider effort that was going on in Singapore at the time called the 10% Energy Challenge, where there was lots of things like road shows and media events, all with the aim of trying to raise public awareness of the need to be more energy efficient. The intervention that actually took place in the treatment schools, what they did was they gave energy education, energy saving tips to the school children, and they actively encouraged students to share those tips when they got home and motivated them to try and save that 10% of their energy use, so set a goal, with the chance to win prizes, and the prizes were book vouchers. And what I think is really important here, and it seems subtle or almost obvious, but I think it's worth noting, is that this intervention specifically did focus on trying to actually, you know, they had a particular strand where they said, look, we need to encourage them to actually bring those tips home and share them with the parents. There are certain school programs that I've read about that don't particularly have that embedded into them. Instead, they kind of just, it's about raising awareness, it's about educating the children. I think one of the main first steps you could take here is to make sure that most of those school education-based programs at least explicitly have a focus on making sure that they bring those tips home and share them with their parents. So the energy savings here were assessed from students who brought in energy bills, as well as accessing lots of energy meter data for lots of different dwellings. And they used a very clever kind of regression discontinuity design here, assuming that only people within 2-kilometer radius of the school would have went to that treatment school, and that was based on the previous research they'd done on school attendance. And so what you see here is about a treatment effect of about 1.6% additional energy savings in the treatment group. So of course there was some energy saving going on, as I say, because there was lots of awareness campaigns. But you can compare the control and treatment group there, the treatment group being in red, and you can see that the energy savings were, or the energy use was lower consistently for the treatment group and was exacerbated by the intervention. So I'll finish up hopefully now in a minute, but just to say what we think is missing or recommendations for future research. There's probably a little bit too much emphasis on household behavior and looking at how to encourage households in particular to save energy within the home. I think we need to continue research in that area, but we also need to prioritize other areas where there has been less research. So for example, in the commercial sector, and particularly in the SME sector of small or medium-sized enterprise. We need much more research on what actually works for encouraging both homeowners and businesses to install energy efficiency measures like insulation. So the actual, if you like, hard measures that will change the energy efficiency of the building or how the heating controls are used, we don't seem to actually know a whole lot about, in terms of randomized evaluations anyway, of what seems to work for driving people to act, or to encouraging people to change that particular behavior, to invest in upgrading their home or their business. The agricultural sector, we didn't specifically focus on it in our search, but from other searches we've done and stuff, we haven't come across a lot of stuff here. So changing farming behavior and practices in developed countries with the explicit interest of trying to reduce carbon emissions or save energy is a relatively understudied topic. Similarly with transport, and I think the real message for us was we really need to embed a culture of utilizing more meter-level data or observed behavioral data and counterfactual impact evaluation so that we can stand over our results and say, yes, these are robust, transferable, and generalizable. And so what I would suggest is that, before and after measures of energy use, if you don't have anything else, they're good, and I think we should do it. But we can aim a little bit higher. Similarly with model energy savings, they have their benefits. They're quick and easy to estimate, and they're useful for kind of policy simulation and so on. But I think the best thing that we really can do is try and use counterfactual methods or randomized field experiments to get the best estimate of the real-world energy savings coming from these type of programs. And to look at an example of what that might look like just before I finish, you can run a randomized control trial, which is the gold standard. So we take a population of energy users, we randomly assign them into groups, we give some one intervention, others no intervention in a control group, and we see what happens, and we measure the difference, and then we can get a good causal estimate. And that's the gold standard, but it's not always possible. What I think is a little bit more realistic and possibly something that we should strive towards is randomized encouragement design. So this is where we have a number of households, say for example, that we want to target to increase the level of insulation or something like that. We focus on a target market of those households where we say, okay, we want these households to do it because that's where the energy efficiency need is. And then we randomly assign them into an encouraged group, which is the treatment group, or an unencouraged group, which is the control group. If you're in the unencouraged group, the control group, you can still apply if you want, but you won't be people won't be chasing you down almost to try and encourage you to apply. Whereas in the treatment group, we'll have extensive intervention like the ones I mentioned, where we're trying to really encourage people to sign up and install this measure. And then we measure the difference between those two groups at the end, and we can get an estimated program savings. I think that's realistic. I think it's something we can do. I think it's something utilities have the ability to help us do. And I think it meets the need for robust quality evidence while also being realistic and cognizant of the fact that these studies are hard to, organize for a policymaker trying to work with utility partners and stuff like that. So I just finish up now and say thank you very much for your attention and for allowing me to speak to you all today. And I'll stick around now and answer some questions the best I can.